This week I had the rare privilege of finding a Hobbytown of Boston ALCO PA-1 kit in mint condition. This is one of the earliest versions of the kit, made back in the mid-1950s. Still got its old warranty card, catalog page, which is in really great shape, the instructions. Now, the reason I know this is an early version is because it has a separate roof piece here, which they ended up just casting into the main body only a few years later. Now, it's not the original version though, because it has the full size trucks for the PA-1. The original version actually used parts from their E-unit kit. It's got the real big DC-90 motor. That should give it a lot of power. A Hobbytown kit is not meant to sit in a box for 60 years. It is meant to be built and run, and oftentimes they'll even outlast their owners. They're so durable and reliable. So I hope you all enjoy following along as I build this kit, painting it and detailing it for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Of course, the first thing to build with a Hobbytown kit is the chassis. So I've got the parts all laid out here: frame, motor, trucks, gears, and axles. One thing about these early kits is that there's a lot of plastic wheels, so I may end up replacing those with some better metal ones, we'll see. And it's got the external gearing instead of the later internal gearing. Well, most of that should be hidden behind a pilot or something though, so it shouldn't look too bad. And then these rubber couplings here, they're pretty hard. They just age over time. So I've got some really nice flexible tubing here. I'll be using that to replace it, and that'll make it work nice and smooth. So, well, let's get started. The first thing you have to do is assemble the truck. These here are the parts for the main power truck: the gears, the gear tower, side frames, main frame, axles. The axles have a 1-to-1 ratio, so the idea is to get them rolling so smooth that you can just set the thing on a piece of track and roll it along with your finger with no bindings or resistance left. It's actually not as hard as it sounds, it just takes a little time. So the first thing you have to do, as the instructions say, is make sure the parts are nice and clean. Now, ordinarily there'd be a little more filing to do, but since these trucks were made when the factory's dies were brand new, there is almost nothing to clean. They're practically perfect. So the little bearings here, they just drop into these little slots. And one thing that's also noted in the instructions, at least with these older ones, is that there are these little lips in the slots. You do not want to file those out because those retain the bearings. If those are gone, the bearings could just fall right out. First thing I do, which isn't actually detailed in the instructions, is to reshape the bearings just a little bit. They are not perfectly conformed to the shape of the axle, so there's a little bit of binding as they are. So I'm taking this freight car axle here. The diameter is just ever so slightly larger than the Hobbytown axle. So I place it in there, and I put the head of a nail on top of it. And this will probably shake the camera a little bit. Just kind of tap that in there. And then that should allow the Hobbytown axle to spin freely once it's placed inside. Just gotta get these washers in line. Place that in there. Yep, that seems to be okay. So I just need to do a little bit of filing to the actual truck because it's holding the axle a little too tightly, but the bearings are spinning freely now, which is good. Alright, I've got both geared axles in there now. You can kind of see where I did some filing of the frame. That got it so that it has just a tiny bit of side-to-side play in there, but you don't want much. These are supposed to be pretty tight, but the axle spins pretty freely now. That's without oil. Now to make sure everything's seated, I flipped the thing over just on those axles, and I kind of press down on that truck and roll it back and forth, and that gets everything in place pretty well. There will be a noticeable difference in how it rolls between before and after it's been seated. Now I've put the drive shaft in there. See, the one in the power truck here has to have almost zero slop in it, and they provide a washer for that. Unfortunately, mine was just a little bit too tight, so one easy way to fix that is to put in a little bit of a thinner washer, but I actually don't have it on hand, so what I did was I very, very carefully pressed this gear on just a little bit farther, and that got it spinning nice and free. And the gear there has to be towards the front where the screw holes are. On the other truck, you actually do want that shaft there to have just a little bit of play going back and forth if you're using drive tubing. That'll give it a little more clearance for going around curves. And now I dropped the axles back in just to make sure it's working freely. That is going pretty smoothly. The gears actually have to wear into each other just a little bit to get rid of the rest of the binding, but I don't feel anything major in there, so that'll work itself out pretty quickly. One thing that is just a little bit tricky is getting it to work freely with the bottom plate screwed on tight. This has similar tight tolerance to the gears in those slots there, so if there is any axle binding, then those will have to be filed out just a little bit to make a little more room. I can kind of see where the axle is binding on this one, so I at least have a point of reference. That'll make it a little easier. Okay, I did just a little bit of filing in there. Didn't need much. That little bit was all it needed to give it that little bit of room to move around, so I know there won't be any binding there. And rolling that thing on that surface, it feels nice and smooth. So I think this is just about ready to go. I just need to put a little oil and grease in there before I do any more, because one thing I found before, you can never ever run these things without grease in those brass gears because they will just grind themselves down in no time. I think you can see I put in a little bit of oil and grease. The light oil is used on all the bearings, and then the grease I put into the gears. So that'll help it to last a lot longer. That also made everything spin quite a bit more freely. So now I'll just drop that dummy axle into there. You're actually not supposed to have any of the drop-in bearings for that because that's held in place by the side frames. Next up is putting the side frames together. These don't take much work. I found that the end holes weren't completely perfect in their drilling locations, so I'm actually using just a slightly larger drill bit to expand the holes, so that way the axles can fit in there easily and spin freely. And the only axles that really need to be absolutely centered are the dummy idlers in the middle, so I left those undrilled. But those screw holes are tapped, and there's the screws right there. They go in easy enough. And then these brackets hold it to the truck. And you have to make sure these screw holes line up with the screw locations on the bottom of the truck. One thing I'll go ahead and note is that some of these side frames were just a little bit warped. This one here is actually fairly straight, but to straighten them out I kind of put my thumbs around the ends there in a place that doesn't have any fragile detail, and then push out just a little bit with my other two fingers. Very gentle with them. Want to make sure they don't break. Just a little bit of that careful bending can help to straighten them out if needed. And there are the assembled side frames with the brackets in there. You want to have them fairly tight, but you also want to have them just loose enough that they can rotate a little bit. That helps with equalization in case the axles have to move around at all. It just helps it to work a little bit smoother. Now I've got the axles in there. You want to make sure to oil all of those before you put them in. Have them spinning nice and freely. And it's easier to get them in by loosening the screws on one side frame a little. Then you can retighten those. I'll just lift that and set it in place. And there's the truck all assembled. So now I'll just give it the free rolling test on the piece of track. And that is smooth as glass, just the way it needs to be.